I just talked to Jimmy Hart yesterday, and he was fine. To have this happen is just horrible.
Nobody expected Hulk Hogan to go out like this. But now things are getting weird. New info from his autopsy just dropped, and it's pointing fingers at Vince McMahon.
Opinion, Hulkamania sucks. I enjoy that when Undertaker was dragging you behind your very own motorcycle like you were just a great big bag of roadkill.
Yeah, that Vince. Turns out something that happened while they were working together might have played a much bigger role in Hogan's death than anyone thought. Let me break it down. How Vince McMahon built his wrestling dynasty on bodies. The wrestling world was shaken to its core on July 24, 2025, when the man who defined an entire generation of sports entertainment, Hulk Hogan, born Terry Jean Bollea, passed away due to cardiac arrest at the age of 71. But what if I told you that this tragic end was not just the result of decades of physical punishment in the ring, but the inevitable conclusion of a systematic culture of exploitation that traces its roots directly back to one man, Vincent Kennedy McMahon? The relationship between McMahon and Hogan was always complex, built on mutual dependency but fundamentally toxic. And perhaps nowhere is this toxic dynamic more clearly illustrated than in this chilling moment from their past.
What a sick man. At one time, you may have been the immortal Hulk Hogan, but no more. Because as I look at you, what I see is an empty shell of what you used to be. You see, what you don't realize, Hulkamania is diseased. Hulkamania has a terminal illness. What I'm trying to tell you, Hogan, is Hulkamania has cancer.
Those words, spoken by McMahon in character, would prove to be prophetic in the most sinister way possible. Because what McMahon was describing wasn't just a storyline, it was the reality he had created. The cancer that was killing Hulkamania wasn't metaphorical, it was the systematic destruction of Terry Bollea's body and soul through decades of exploitation. To understand how we got to July 24th, 2025, we need to travel back to the golden age of wrestling, the 1980s, when McMahon was transforming his father's regional wrestling territory into a global entertainment juggernaut. This was the era that would later be known as the steroid era, and it was during this time that the seeds of Hogan's eventual demise were planted. Picture this. It's the height of Hulkamania, and arenas across America are packed with screaming fans chanting for their blonde-haired, mustachioed hero. But behind the scenes, a different kind of drama was unfolding. McMahon had a vision. He wanted his wrestlers to look like comic book superheroes, larger-than-life figures that would capture the imagination of audiences worldwide. To achieve this vision, he needed his performers to achieve physiques that were simply impossible through natural means alone. During the 1980s and early 1990s, professional wrestling, particularly under the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, now WE, experienced a boom in popularity, driven by larger-than-life figures like Hulk Hogan. Promoters, including Vince McMahon, emphasized muscular physiques to enhance the spectacle, creating pressure for wrestlers to use anabolic steroids to achieve and maintain exaggerated body types. The culture that McMahon fostered wasn't just about entertainment, it was about creating an impossible standard that his wrestlers felt compelled to meet, regardless of the long-term consequences to their health. This wasn't accidental, it was systematic. McMahon understood that the more superhuman his wrestlers appeared, the more money he could make. And if achieving that meant his performers had to pump their bodies full of dangerous substances, well, that was a price he was apparently willing to let them pay. Hogan became the crown jewel of this dangerous system, the poster child for what could be achieved when human limits were pushed beyond breaking point, and the evidence of what the system did to him would eventually emerge in the most tragic way possible.
Well, here's the deal. I need a job.
Okay.
I quit TNA, that was a shoot.
This moment, captured years later, reveals the vulnerability that McMahon's system created. Here was the man who had made McMahon billions, reduced to joking about needing work, his body broken, his health deteriorating, still trying to maintain the facade of strength that McMahon's system demanded. Hogan openly admitted to using anabolic steroids during his wrestling career, particularly from the 1970s to the early 1990s. But this wasn't just a personal choice. It was a professional necessity in the world that McMahon had created. The most damning evidence of McMahon's direct involvement came during the 1994 federal trial, where he was accused of distributing steroids to WWF wrestlers. Hogan testified under immunity that he used steroids for approximately 14 years, from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, to enhance his physique and aid recovery from injuries. He emphasized that the steroids were obtained through prescriptions, often from Dr. George Zahorian, a WWF ringside doctor convicted in 1991 of illegally distributing steroids. Think about that for a moment. The WWF had its own ringside doctor who was literally convicted of illegally distributing steroids. This wasn't some rogue operation happening without McMahon's knowledge. This was systematic, institutional, and it was happening right under his nose, with his wrestlers, in his organization. But the steroid culture was just one part of a larger, more insidious problem: the physical demands that McMahon placed on his performers. Wrestlers often perform 100, 200 matches per year without an off-season, leading to chronic injuries like spinal damage, joint issues, and concussions. This grueling schedule wasn't born out of necessity, it was born out of greed. McMahon had discovered that he could maximize profits by running his performers into the ground, quite literally. The more shows they performed, the more money he made. And if they got injured in the process, well, there were always more hungry young wrestlers willing to take their place. Hogan tearing his pec muscle, Andre being sick. These weren't just unfortunate incidents, they were part of the narrative that McMahon was selling. Pain became entertainment, injury became storyline, and human suffering became profit. The wrestling ring conditions in the 1970s and 1980s, described as hard and unforgiving, for example, 22-foot boxing ring with lumps and boards sticking up, contributed to severe back issues. Hogan noted that the equipment and ring conditions exacerbated his injuries, leading to chronic pain and the need for repeated back surgeries. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. McMahon wasn't just aware of these conditions, he was actively profiting from them. Every time Hogan stepped into that ring, every time he performed his signature leg drop that would eventually destroy his spine, every time he pushed his steroid-enhanced body beyond its natural limits, McMahon was counting the money rolling in. The leg drop, Hogan's finishing move that thrilled millions of fans, became a metaphor for his entire relationship with McMahon's empire. Every time he performed it, he was literally destroying his own body for the entertainment of others and the profit of his boss. And McMahon? He was ringside, watching it all happen, knowing full well the long-term consequences. The evidence of McMahon's callous disregard for his performers' well-being extends far beyond just Hogan. A 2014 study by Eastern Michigan University found that professional wrestlers from 1985 to 2011 had mortality rates up to 2.9 times higher than the general U.S. male population, with cardiovascular disease and drug-related issues as leading causes. This wasn't just bad luck. This was the predictable result of the culture that McMahon had created and perpetuated for decades. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is how McMahon managed to distance himself from the consequences of his actions. When wrestlers died young, when they suffered from chronic pain, when they battled addiction to painkillers, McMahon always seemed to emerge unscathed, his hands apparently clean, his fortune intact. The relationship between McMahon and Hogan was always complex, built on mutual dependency, but fundamentally unequal. Hogan made McMahon rich beyond his wildest dreams, transforming wrestling from a regional curiosity into a global phenomenon. But what did Hogan get in return? Fame, certainly. Money, yes. But also a lifetime of pain, addiction, and ultimately, a heart that couldn't withstand the decades of abuse his body had endured. And the consequences of this system are still being felt today, decades later. Long-term anabolic steroid use is associated with significant health risks, particularly cardiovascular issues, which may have contributed to Hogan's death. The heart attack that killed Hogan on that July morning wasn't just a medical event. It was the final chapter in a story that began decades earlier in McMahon's empire. As we delve deeper into this investigation, we'll uncover more evidence of how McMahon's systematic exploitation of his performers created the conditions that led directly to Hogan's death. We'll explore the culture of fear and intimidation that kept wrestlers silent about their pain, the financial pressures that kept them performing even when their bodies were breaking down, and the web of enablers and conspirators who helped McMahon build his empire on the broken bodies of those who trusted him. The death of Hulk Hogan wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime, and Vince McMahon's fingerprints are all over the weapon. McMahon's machine devours its greatest star. The machine that Vince McMahon built didn't just consume bodies, it consumed souls. And nowhere is this more evident than in the systematic destruction of Terry Gene Bollea, the man who became Hulk Hogan, the performer who made McMahon billions, and ultimately the victim whose death can be traced directly back to the culture of exploitation that McMahon created and perpetuated. But before we dive into the devastating details of Hogan's physical and psychological deterioration, we need to understand something crucial. McMahon knew. He knew what his business was doing to his performers. He knew the long-term consequences of the culture he had created, and he chose profit over people, time and time again. The evidence for this isn't hidden in some secret vault. It's been playing out in public for decades, captured on camera, documented in court proceedings, and revealed in the broken voices of the performers themselves. And those voices tell a story of systematic exploitation that would ultimately claim the life of wrestling's biggest star. But perhaps the most revealing moment of Hogan's vulnerability came years later, when the toll of McMahon's system had already begun to show. Here we see the real Terry Bollea, not the character that McMahon had created and profited from, but the broken man underneath. The steroid use, the family problems, the personal destruction, all of it can be traced back to the pressures and toxicity of the system that McMahon had built around him. This is what McMahon's system produced, not just physical destruction, but complete psychological breakdown. The man who had made McMahon billions was sitting in a bathroom, contemplating suicide, broken and destroyed by the very machine that had elevated him to stardom. Let's start with the physical destruction, because that's where McMahon's culpability is most clear and most damning. Hogan underwent approximately 25 surgeries in the decade before his passing, addressing injuries sustained from high-impact wrestling matches and the physical demands of his larger-than-life persona. These included 10 back surgeries, knee and hip replacements, shoulder surgeries, neck surgery, cervical fusion, May 2025, eye and abdominal surgeries, 25 surgeries. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's not just bad luck or the natural consequence of an athletic career. That's the systematic destruction of a human body over decades of abuse. And every single one of those surgeries can be traced back to decisions made by Vince McMahon, decisions about ring construction, about match frequency, the types of moves that were encouraged and rewarded in his organization. But here's where it gets even more sinister. McMahon didn't just know that his business was destroying his performers' bodies, he actively profited from their destruction. The more spectacular the moves, the more punishment the wrestlers could endure, the more money he made. Hogan's signature, leg drop, the move that thrilled millions and became his trademark, was literally destroying his spine with every performance. The physical demands of wrestling, including high-impact moves like body slams, notably against the 520-pound Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, and leg drops, contributed to Hogan's injuries. The poorly designed rings of his early career, as he described to Logan Paul, amplified the damage. McMahon was there at WrestleMania 3, watching as Hogan lifted Andre the Giant, a man who weighed over 500 pounds, and slammed him to the mat. He saw the strain on Hogan's face, the way his body contorted under the impossible weight. And what was his reaction? To make sure it was captured on camera from every angle, to replay it endlessly in promotional materials, to turn that moment of physical destruction into a marketing goldmine. But the physical destruction was just the beginning. McMahon's machine also systematically destroyed the psychological well-being of his performers, creating conditions that led inevitably to addiction, depression, and despair. The chronic pain from wrestling injuries led Hogan to struggle with addiction to prescription painkillers and alcohol. In a 2023 interview with People magazine, he described a period 5 to 6 years prior where he was in crazy pain and relied heavily on pain medication, even when the pain subsided. This addiction didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the predictable result of a system that pushed performers beyond their physical limits, then offered them pharmaceutical solutions to manage the pain, with no regard for the long-term consequences. The pressure, the scrutiny, the impossible standards, all of it contributed to the breakdown of the human being behind the character, and the timing of this addiction is crucial. Hogan described being in crazy pain 5 to 6 years before his death. That would place his worst struggles with addiction around 2019 to 2020. This wasn't ancient history. This was recent, ongoing suffering that can be directly traced back to decisions McMahon made decades earlier. But perhaps the most damning evidence of McMahon's systematic exploitation comes from understanding how the steroid culture he created continued to affect his performers long after they stopped using the drugs. Research indicates that anabolic androgenic steroids, AAS, increase the risk of cardiovascular issues, including left ventricular hypertrophy, LVH, acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, arrhythmias, and heart failure. These conditions arise because steroids can elevate blood pressure, alter lipid profiles, and cause thickening of the heart muscle, all of which strain the cardiovascular system. This isn't speculation. This is medical fact. The steroids that Hogan used during his peak years in McMahon's organization didn't just enhance his physique, they fundamentally altered his cardiovascular system in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. And McMahon knew this. He had access to the same medical research, the same doctors, the same information that we have today. He chose to ignore it. This moment reveals the complete control that McMahon's system exercised over his performers. With the push of a button, decades of work, an entire legacy could be erased. The psychological power this gave McMahon over his performers was absolute, and he wielded it ruthlessly. The web of enablers that McMahon created around this destructive culture is equally damning. Hogan emphasized that the steroids were obtained through prescriptions, often from Dr. George Zahorian, a WWF ringside doctor convicted in 1991 of illegally distributing steroids. McMahon didn't just allow this to happen. He facilitated it by employing doctors who were willing to compromise their medical ethics for the sake of the show. But the truly insidious part of McMahon's operation was how he managed to maintain plausible deniability while creating and perpetuating a culture that virtually guaranteed his performers would suffer long-term health consequences. He never had to explicitly order steroid use. He just had to create an environment where it was impossible to succeed without it. Think about the psychological pressure this created. You're a young wrestler. You've dreamed your entire life of making it to the big time, and you finally get your shot with Vince McMahon's WWF. You look around the locker room, and you see that everyone who's successful, everyone who's making money, everyone who's getting pushed has a physique that's clearly enhanced. What choice do you really have? Even in his darkest moments, we can see how the toxic culture that McMahon created affected every relationship in Hogan's life. The pressure, the scrutiny, the impossible standards. They poisoned everything, even the relationship with his own daughter. McMahon didn't need to say the words "take steroids." His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. By consistently pushing and promoting wrestlers with obviously enhanced physiques, by creating storylines that emphasized physical dominance and superhuman strength, by rewarding performers who looked like comic book characters, he created a culture where steroid use wasn't just encouraged, it was required for survival. And the consequences of this culture extended far beyond just the wrestlers themselves. Wrestlers are often classified as independent contractors, limiting access to company-sponsored health insurance, which exacerbates long-term health issues. McMahon structured his business in a way that maximized his profits while minimizing his responsibility for the long-term health of his performers. This wasn't an oversight. This was a deliberate business strategy. By classifying wrestlers as independent contractors, McMahon could avoid paying for health insurance, workers' compensation, and other benefits that might have helped his performers manage the long-term consequences of their careers. He wanted all the benefits of having a stable of performers while accepting none of the responsibility for their well-being. Hogan's later years paint a particularly tragic picture of this abandonment. In 2023, fellow wrestler Kurt Angle claimed Hogan was using a cane due to loss of sensation and pain in his back, though Angle's representative later disputed this, stating Hogan was okay. The fact that there was confusion and conflicting reports about Hogan's condition speaks to a broader pattern of secrecy and denial that McMahon's organization cultivated around wrestler health issues. But perhaps the most telling evidence of McMahon's callous disregard for his performers' well-being comes from his own words and actions over the years. When confronted with evidence of the systematic health problems affecting his wrestlers, when faced with studies showing dramatically higher mortality rates among professional wrestlers, when presented with the undeniable connection between the culture he created and the suffering of his performers, McMahon's response has consistently been to deny, deflect, and distance himself from responsibility. The machine that Vince McMahon built consumed many lives over the decades, but perhaps none were more valuable to him, and none paid a higher price than the man who made him billions, Hulk Hogan. Identifying the pattern. Hulk Hogan's death on July 24, 2025, wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was simply the latest casualty in a decades-long war that Vince McMahon has waged against the human body. The cardiac arrest that claimed wrestling's biggest star was just one more name to add to a graveyard that McMahon has been filling for over 40 years. A systematic pattern of exploitation and neglect that has left behind a trail of broken bodies, shattered minds, and grieving families. Let's start with the most tragic and preventable death in wrestling history, a death that happened live on television in front of millions of viewers while Vince McMahon watched from his executive chair. Owen Hart died at age 34 during a WWE event, Over the Edge 1999, when a stunt malfunction caused him to fall 78 feet from the rafters, resulting in fatal internal injuries. But this wasn't just a tragic accident. This was corporate manslaughter in front of a live audience. The circumstances surrounding Owen Hart's death reveal everything we need to know about McMahon's priorities. Owen was scheduled to be lowered from the rafters in an elaborate entrance designed to maximize spectacle and drama. But the equipment used was inadequate, the safety protocols were insufficient, and the entire stunt was designed with one priority in mind: entertainment value, not performer safety. Owen Hart fell 78 feet to his death because Vince McMahon wanted a spectacular entrance more than he wanted to protect his performer's life. And when Owen hit that ring, when his body was broken and his life was ending, what did McMahon do? He continued the show. He didn't stop the event. He didn't pause to honor the man who had just died for his entertainment empire. He kept the cameras rolling and the money coming in. Eddie Guerrero died at age 38 from heart failure, attributed to years of steroid use and the physical toll of wrestling. Eddie's death was a direct result of the steroid culture that McMahon created and perpetuated throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Guerrero's high-flying style and intense schedule led to chronic injuries and substance abuse issues. Autopsy reports suggested his heart was enlarged due to long-term steroid use. An enlarged heart. That's what McMahon's system produced. Not just entertainment, not just profits, but enlarged hearts that would eventually kill the men who made him rich. Eddie Guerrero was found dead in his hotel room, another victim of the pharmaceutical culture that McMahon had fostered. The steroids that Eddie felt compelled to use to succeed in McMahon's system literally changed the structure of his heart, making it impossible for that vital organ to function properly. Perhaps no case illustrates the devastating neurological consequences of McMahon's system more clearly than Chris Benoit. Benoit died at age 40 in a murder-suicide with brain damage from concussions, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, cited as a contributing factor. Benoit's aggressive wrestling style, including diving headbutts, caused multiple concussions. Post-mortem studies revealed severe brain damage, linking his actions to the cumulative effects of head trauma. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. This was the inevitable result of a system that encouraged and rewarded moves that were systematically destroying performers' brains. McMahon knew about the dangers of repeated head trauma. The medical evidence was available, the research was published, the warnings were clear. But Chris Benoit's diving headbutt was entertaining. It got crowd reactions, it made money. So McMahon allowed it to continue, match after match, year after year, until Chris Benoit's brain was so damaged that he was no longer capable of rational thought. The murder-suicide that ended Chris Benoit's life wasn't just a criminal act. It was the final chapter in a story of systematic neurological destruction that began with McMahon's decision to prioritize entertainment over brain safety. When Benoit killed his family and then himself, McMahon's system claimed not just one life, but three. Some fates are worse than death, and Darren Drozdov's story proves it. In 1999, Drozdov was paralyzed from the neck down after a botched powerbomb by D'Lo Brown during a WWE match. The injury ended his wrestling career and left him quadriplegic, requiring lifelong care. Drozdov passed away in 2023, with his condition linked to the wrestling injury. 24 years. For 24 years, Darren Drozdov lived as a quadriplegic because of a wrestling move gone wrong in McMahon's ring. Think about that for a moment. A young man in the prime of his life, paralyzed from the neck down, spending the next 2 decades of his life unable to move, unable to care for himself, all for a few minutes of entertainment in McMahon's traveling circus of destruction. The death of Hulk Hogan, the paralysis of Darren Drozdov, the brain damage that destroyed Chris Benoit, the enlarged hearts that killed Eddie Guerrero and Randy Savage. These aren't isolated tragedies. They're the predictable results of a system designed to extract maximum entertainment value from human bodies with minimal regard for the long-term consequences. The question isn't whether Vince McMahon is responsible for these deaths. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is when we'll finally hold him accountable for the systematic killing machine he's created and operated for over 40 years. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.